Hey everyone, today we're going to be talking about the circle of Willis. Before I get started, I just want us to orient ourselves. So this up here is anterior part of the brain, and this right here is the posterior part of the brain. Now, this in the middle is the optic chiasm, which I have labeled OC, and this right here is just the spinal cord in a cross section, and I'll explain why that's there in a moment. Now, before we get started, I just want to talk about the anterior and posterior circulations of the brain. So the anterior circulation of the brain, we can kind of divide the blood supply of the brain into, the anterior and the posterior circulation. So the anterior circulation is mainly derived from the internal carotid artery, which I have just circled, the internal carotid artery. When you draw it out like this, most of the time you're going to see it on the diagrams like this as well. Think of the internal carotid artery kind of coming out of the page towards us, and it would be those two circles over there. And the posterior circulation of the brain is mainly derived from the vertebral arteries, which are these big long arteries over here. Okay. One other thing that I want to clarify before we start labeling all these blood vessels is the cerebellum is all these pink stripes that I have put over here. That represents the cerebellum, okay? And one other thing that I want to say is that this right here, this is the spinal cord. That is the spinal cord. This right here, this is the pons. And this right here would be where the midbrain is located, okay? And of course, this right here would be the medulla. Okay, so starting off, I usually like to start off from the bottom and work my way up to the top. So at the bottom here, we have these two really big arteries that we talked about. So this would be your vertebral artery, okay? And this is a paired structure. As you can see, there's another vertebral artery here. And one of the branches, the most important branch of the vertebral artery is pica, also known as the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Okay, and off of the pica, which is also a branch structure, as you can see, we have a pica on this side as well. And coming off of pica is this artery right here. This is the posterior spinal artery. Okay, and the posterior spinal artery, it's important because it supplies the posterior 1/3 of the spinal cord right here. So this would be the posterior spinal artery. Okay, and the rest 2/3, the anterior 2/3 of the spinal cord would be supplied by the anterior spinal artery. And we can see the anterior spinal artery coming off the basilar artery right here, okay? So they kind of come off and then they join together and run straight midline down the entire spinal cord, okay? So this right here would be the anterior spinal artery, okay? Now, as we keep going up, the vertebral arteries eventually join right here. They eventually join, and at this junction, the vertebral arteries become the basilar artery. So this big artery right here, very clinically relevant, would be the basilar artery. So let me go ahead and label that. So this is going to be the basilar artery. And the first branch, this is very important for exams, the first branch coming off the basilar artery is ICA, or the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. Now just think about it, guys. The posterior inferior cerebellar artery, I mentioned that this part of the brain is posterior, okay? And this part of the brain is anterior. So when you're more posterior, it's going to be called posterior inferior cerebellar artery. And when you're more anterior, it's going to be called anterior inferior cerebellar artery. Okay? And this branch coming off of anterior inferior cerebellar artery would be the labyrinthine artery. Okay, this is also known as the internal acoustic artery. It supplies the ear. Okay, and as we keep going, so let's keep following this basilar artery. So just recall that the first branch that we just talked about, the basilar artery, was the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, also known as ICA, okay? So as we keep going, you're going to be seeing all these little branches of arteries. These are called the pontine arteries, okay? And why? Why are they called the pontine arteries? Because like I said, this is the pons right here. This is the pons. This whole thing is the pons. So the pontine arteries are going to supply the pons, okay? And as we keep following the basilar artery, we get another branch right here. So this branch, this branch is called the superior cerebellar artery, okay? Superior cerebellar artery. Now, let's keep going up, and this final branch is very important, and the reason for that is because it is the termination of the posterior circulation of brain. It's the termination of the posterior circulation of the brain. So this is the last blood vessel of the posterior circulation of the brain, okay? That's very important. And what is this blood vessel called? This is called the posterior cerebral artery, okay? This one is very important. So that concludes the posterior circulation of the brain. Now we're going to move on to the anterior circulation of the brain. So all of this would be considered posterior circulation of the brain, okay? Now, we're going to keep on going, and we're going to see this branch. Now, before I actually get started on that, let me just quickly mention what this P1 and P2 is. So, essentially, this is just gives us like the location of the specific area of the posterior cerebral artery. We also have A1 and A2 for the anterior cerebral artery, so we can essentially just be more specific with our terminology, okay? So P1 would be this inner part of the posterior cerebral artery, while P2 would be this outer part of the posterior cerebral artery, okay? And then, following this posterior cerebral artery, we got this artery right here, okay? Communicating artery. That is the posterior communicating artery. And the way I think of it is that, you know, since this is the posterior cerebral artery, it's connected to the posterior cerebral artery, and it's communicating to the internal carotid artery here. So that would make this and this the internal carotid artery, okay? So this right here is the internal carotid artery. And coming off the internal carotid artery, the very first branch of the internal carotid artery, first branch, is the ophthalmic artery. Ophthalmic artery. Okay, and that's pretty important because, you know, it's close to the optic chiasm, so it's pretty clinically relevant for vision. And in the next video, I'll be talking about the consequences of, you know, what can happen if the vascular supply to any of these blood vessels is compromised. Okay, now this artery right here is the middle cerebral artery. The middle cerebral artery. And coming off of the middle cerebral artery are all these little small branches called the lenticulostriate arteries. Now these are very clinically relevant because if someone has hypertension, we can get an infarct in the basal ganglia, something called a lacunar infarct, and I'll get into more detail in the next video. However, that's a very high yield association, so that's something to remember. Lenticulostriate arteries with hypertension can compromise the basal ganglia and thalamus as well. And I actually missed this branch right here. This branch would be the anterior choroidal artery. Okay. And now we're at, you know, the top of the circle of Willis. So this whole thing right here, this would be the anterior cerebral artery. So anterior cerebral artery. Okay. And this would be the A2 segment up here. That's the A2 segment. And this is the A1 segment right here. And between them right here, this is actually a different artery. This is very important. This one is called anterior communicating artery. Now, the anterior communicating artery is also very clinically relevant because it is the most common site of something called a Berry aneurysm. As you can imagine, this is a very small artery, and because of the anatomy here, the vascular wall is just not as strong as the other arteries, and because of that, we can get a Berry aneurysm. And if a Berry aneurysm ruptures, you can actually get a subarachnoid hemorrhage, which would be described as, you know, the worst headache of someone's life. And that's something that needs to be taken care of immediately. Okay, and that essentially concludes all of the arteries. So after going through all of this, I just want to make it clear that the circle of Willis contains the ACA, so the anterior cerebral artery. It also contains the anterior communicating artery. It contains the anterior communicating artery. It contains the posterior cerebral artery. So it contains the posterior cerebral artery and the posterior communicating artery. Okay? So these four are what make the circle of Willis right there. Okay? And that's particularly important to know. All right, let me know if you guys have any questions. I hope this video was helpful for you, and I'll see you guys in the next one.